I don't.
I don't.
I need Harry Love to explain what makes him good. There was a guy there named Harry Love, and he was always hitting on the women. It was like sometimes life imitates art.
Where did you get this?
That was
This was one page.
on the book I made.
Wow.
It had an elf in front.
An elf?
Green fellow.
Elf?
Who was that nice little fellow that was a producer there? His name was Art. Art Scott.
Art Scott.
And he always handed these out to people.
Oh,
And I was looking at it, and I realized Pete Alvarado drew this.
he did.
Yeah.
That's his style.
Yeah.
It was definitely.
Okay, hi, I'm your moderator, Phil Ortiz, and I have panelists practically three legends in the animation industry. There was a fourth one, Russ Keith. I'm not sure what happened to him, but we will have this panel with.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah, well, anyway, I just want to introduce you to the panelists, and if you could just mention a little something about yourself, that would be great. So let's just go down, one at a time, from left to right, or right to left. Scott Shaw, would you like to start it?
Oh, well, I was the last guy to leave the studio. Willie, you're one of our forefathers. Why don't you talk? It just gets boring when I have.
Well, basically, I started, let's see, what year did I start the Jetsons was in production. I just wrapped up with Bob Clampett. He was unable to sell another season. So I got a call from a fellow named Alex Lodi, and he says, hey kid, if you're available, come on over. So I did. And Monday morning, I walked into the studio, and sitting at a desk was Iwo Takamoto, who was the famous young fellow that hired me at Disney Studio, and then I worked under his ruling tutelage, so here we are again. We reunited, and I worked with Iwo for 14 years at Hanna-Barbera, starting with the Jetsons. The Jetsons was in development, so I kind of stepped in there, and then the first episode went into production, and then worked on the Jetsons series. And then thereafter, we had so many projects and series and whatever. I can't remember what I worked on, but people come up and says, hey, Hong Kong Fooey. Yeah. And God knows how many shows. It's funny, someone sent me a Google printout of all the Hanna-Barbera credits that I had. And to this day, I keep thinking, I didn't work on that. But apparently I did. So in 1975, I left, spent a year with Sam Riel. I talked about it earlier, the Hello Kitty studio. And then that's when I decided I am totally burnt out with the art of animation. So I went back to Disney in consumer products. And that's where I retired from, 13 years ago now. So trying to live the good life.
Willie went back to the Disney convalescent home.
Willie just didn't want a staff position because it tends to get in the way of your freelance gig.
I started working for Willie in 1972, I think, on Josie and the Pussycats. I think you probably did. I had worked at Hanna-Barbera earlier, but unofficially, I was a stealth animator on Johnny Quest. So I was working for Disney at that time, so I didn't want that known. but I didn't officially begin H&B until '72. And then I think shortly thereafter, I must have met Scott Shaw and I guess some of the other people. I'm losing track of the timeline now because this is like ancient history, you know, it's carved in stone. I can kind of remember my past, but I was at Hanna-Barbera easily 7 years or more. Maybe it was more, I don't know, but so many shows I can't even remember them. People have to come up and tell me what I worked on because I've long since forgotten.
Quite frankly, I'm kind of glad I've forgotten some of it. because I was a huge fan of Willie's when I was a kid, and of course I still am, but it was, by the time I came on, I started out doing comic books for Hanna-Barbera, the ones that Marvel published in the mid-'70s. I started out inking them and penciling them and then writing them and doing all three. And they hired me to come in because they were working on a new Flintstones series, and those were my favorite characters, so I said, sure. But when I got there, they hadn't started the series yet, so they hired me to work, well, they told me to work on Godzilla. And that's where I met Floyd, and that was in, I believe, like autumn of '78.
Yeah, 77, 78, you're right, yeah, Godzilla. But Doug Wildey was the producer.
Yeah. Doug Wildey said, he says, you don't draw the humans too good, do you? Well, I said, I'm a cartoony cartoonist. He goes, yeah, you're one of them Bigfoot guys. Meaning I drew characters with big feet, not that I drew Bigfoot, who also Godzilla show. But he said, well, he says, do me a favor, only draw the scenes with monsters, don't draw any people. And I was like, great, I can't draw people very well. Monsters, thank you. And within a few months, we finally started on this new Flintstones vehicle, which had the really exciting title of The New Fred and Barney Show. And eventually it became the Fred and Barney Meet the Thing, and Fred and Barney Meet the Shmoo, and whatever show wasn't getting ratings, they wound up coming up with this bogus idea of bundling them together because kids would watch the Flintstones. But that's where I first met Floyd, and we worked together on projects and have been buddies ever since. Floyd's really one of my mentors, whether he knew it or not. He spent a lot of time calming me down while I was ranting about, well, no wonder these cartoons are crap. No wonder they can't make them funny back when Willie Ito was working on them.
Maybe the cartoons weren't that funny, but boy, we sure had a lot of fun.
That's really true. I'm curious if it was that way back when you were working.
Well, like there's like 3 generations of layout. When I was there, you know, things were a little more settled because we had some of these old timers from MGM studio that Bill and Joe brought over. And these are the classic old timers that Tom and Jerry animation and all that. And they're real seasoned veterans. So here comes a bunch of upstarts with a lot of energy. And when we got tired, we went bonkers. and the smallest sound would just gravitate into screaming and hollering. And these old timers would just sit there and cringe. And there was a old Disney veteran. His name was Lance Maui.
Oh, man, yeah, that's not.
And he'd sit in the corner and he would be cringing. Do you have any little kids in here?
Well, they're going to grow up real fast.
Because he would, under his breath, say, "Fucking idiots." So us young guys were all known as fucking idiots.
Yeah, I know the old Disney guys, like Lance Nolly and others, you know, because they came from the convalescent home over in Burbank. They wore a white shirt and tie to work. And a lot of these guys took their job seriously. And they saw us as these crazy young upstarts always raising hell and making noise. And they thought, what's wrong with these damn kids? You know, what's wrong with these kids today? I mean, I guess how many generations have said that? What's wrong with these kids? And here we are, the old timers now.
And by the time I started there, I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but I wound up being assigned to kind of be working under Floyd as the head of various units on different shows. And I think it was the best way for me to learn the mechanics of animation in general very quickly. But we had guys on our crew whose resumes would have been the history of animation.
That's right.
Even at that time, we had guys working on our crew on Casper and the Space Angels who'd worked on Snow White and Pinocchio. And they all, I think a lot of them found me, instead of irritating, they found me kind of amusing. And it's only in recent years I realized why. Here they were working at the absolute nadir of their careers, working on some of the crappiest cartoons ever, and yet they were so amused that I thought I was like in Valhalla because I was at the studio that had done the Flintstones, and meeting some of those guys was such a big deal that they couldn't help, I think, but laugh and think about how they were when they started in the business too. It was like, maybe there wasn't the kind of fandom that there is now, but I think, except for certain very serious individuals, most of us became cartoonists because we loved what we saw when we were kids, whether it was Disney or Jay Ward or even some of the horrible things that I worked on. I mean, when you've done this for a while, you find out that no matter how embarrassed you may be about a show you worked on, it's a lot of people's favorite show ever. You know? And you don't want to insult them by saying, that piece of shit. but I absolutely love being there, and I found myself working surprisingly a lot with Bill and Joe themselves. The first time I was in a meeting with Joe Barbera. Now, you got to understand what Bill and Joe were like. Joe really thought that he was like the king of Hollywood. It never seemed to occur to him that animation was like a skin tag on the line of Hollywood. It was not the productions that ran Hollywood. We were kind of the, and then there's the animation. That Joe always dressed like a millionaire. He always was wearing like these yachting jackets and cravats, and his hair was always deep black, no matter how old he was. And he always had like this kind of man-tan, suntan. And by the opposite, Bill Hanna was a guy that always worked in his shirt sleeves. If he wore a tie, it was completely unknotted, just hanging around his neck. And people wonder how they worked. Well, by the time I was there, at least, Joe was in charge of selling the shows, and Bill was in charge of making the shows.
Right.
So Bill had to essentially live up to Joe's promises. And well, as I told some of the people who were here earlier, when I worked on the Ed Gridley show, Martin Short was like, flipping out because this stuff looked so crummy. And I said, look, I worked my hardest to make it good, but you are working at Hanna-Barbera. He said, but the executive producer said these would look like the finest Warner Brothers cartoons. And I said, not even Warner Brothers can make the finest Warner Brothers. I'm lying to you. And it's like by that time he made the deal and the show was going on the air like in 3 days or something. But Joe was there for the, I think, in his mind, glamour, and Bill was there for the money. And yet, even though I kind of they definitely were kind of scoundrels. They were scoundrels that I liked very much working for.
Lovable scoundrels.
Yeah. Bill Hanna once took me to the side after working on editing a show, and it was my birthday, and I mentioned to him, I said, when I was a little kid, If you told me I was going to be spending my birthday with William Hanna, I would have thought that my head would have exploded. I said, how come we're not having fun? He kind of looked at me like I was nuts because they could never even figure out why I would tell them that their cartoons were such an influence on me. But he took me aside and he put his arm around my shoulder, and in all seriousness he said, kids, don't create anything if you can steal it. I kind of acted like I thought he was joking around, but even as a kid I knew, okay, the Flintstones were the honeymooners, and Huckleberry Hound is is essentially a Tex Avery character, and it's like almost everything they ever did that I liked owed a lot to something else that I liked even younger. But after a certain point, their stuff kind of just, the factory aspect took over, but I still think their early cartoons hold up very well. And of course, the Tom and Jerry's, which were done with a whole different budget and schedule, still make me laugh out loud. As old as I am, they still feel very fresh and new somehow.
Yeah, Hanna and Barbera. The studio bosses were so different in the old days. I mean, we used to joke about how much we hated our bosses, but in reality, we really loved our bosses. The bosses we hate are the ones who are running things today. These are the guys we truly hate. But guys like Walt Disney and Hanna-Barbera and Tex Avery and Frizz and Chuck Jones, all those guys were great. I mean, even Chuck was great compared to the, dare I say it, the scoundrels who run animation today.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. These were truly the good old days.
Yeah, Joe was a super salesman. The studio was at its maximum as far as production was going on. Joe and some of the writers would go to their favorite Italian restaurant in Hollywood, and they would sit there and talk a story and whatever, on a cocktail napkin. Someone would make a quick little sketch of a new character they were discussing. Joe would literally take this cocktail napkin, the sketch, put it in his pocket, take the red eye to New York, and sell a show based on this, because he would act it out in front of the agency guys and sponsors and whatever. Then he'd get on the phone and say, hey, Hanna, build another crew to take care of another half hour, 13 or 26 half hours. And Hanna on this side, God, where am I going to get all these people? So what he had to do is he would call New York, and he used to, Joe used to work with Terry Toons. And there's a lot of retired old people that worked for Max Fleischer and Terry Toons and whatever. They were all in retirement. And he would recruit them to come out to California, all expenses paid, to help animate these shows. Well, these guys that animated Betty Boop and Heckle and Jekyll and all that, they did rubber hose animation. I'm sure you've heard the term. The early black and white Mickeys had rubber hose animation. No skeletal structure. So some of the shows that were coming down the pipe were superhero shows. Shows like what Alex Toth would design, Doug Wildey, Super Friends, and Johnny Quest and whatever. But these animators were trained to draw this way. So that's the reason why we have so many superhero comic book artists that were recruited, so they could sit down and do key poses, and the animators will just be able to get between it and still keep the proportions and the structure of these live action type characters. at that point, the studio was just, breaking open at its seams, and so we needed space. And we were in a brand new studio that was built specifically for Hanna-Barbera. But before we knew it, we had annexes across the street and down the street, and Hanna would encourage his old-time animators from MGM days to work at home. And these guys turned out, because the incentive was so much a foot above and beyond their basic pay. That's what greed said.
Yeah.
And they were making so much money. These guys were driving to work in numerous cities. And it was just, well, I would say, again, it was the golden age of television animation. You know, where all was working.
When Hanna-Barbera got started, they really got started at MGM. I asked them about this because I believe MGM was their animation department officially closed their doors like in May of '57. And by November '57, they had Rough and Ready already running on the air. And I asked him, I said, Joe liked to be called Mr. B. You know, that he thought that was cool. And I said, Mr. B, I said, how could you possibly have a show ready for airing that fast? And he said, well, once we knew that they were shutting down our unit, they really, all they cared about was us finishing the cartoons that were already on the schedule. So he said, we developed Rough and Ready on MGM's dime. In fact, and I don't think it was a setup, but they were actually going to break up their partnership because Bill Hanna had been offered a job directing the Crusader Rabbit show in the second season was in color. Well, Bill apparently went over there, they showed him what they were doing, they said, okay, these were all of our cost-cutting methods. A lot of the dialogue was by the narrator, so you didn't have to do any voice sync. They were all continued episodes, so you could reuse footage at the head of them catching up with what happened last time. You know, there were mainly only 2 characters on screen at any given time. And sure enough, Rough and Ready wound up having almost the identical format to Crusader Rabbit, even to the length where you could air them as 5-minute cartoons, or you could edit them together to be a half-hour cartoon. I mean, they were, and what's even more interesting was, to me at least, going back and comparing them, their production values were much better than the production values of Crusader Rabbit because they had painters that had worked at Warner's or at MGM. I mean, when H&B started, it was kind of when everybody else was folding. And their offices at the time were in the old Chapman studio right across the street from Playhouse Pictures, which was an animation studio formed to do commercials. So, you know, Bo Cannon would have dropped off some animation for a commercial, and he's going to his car. Bill Hanna told me he'd lean out the window and go, hey, you want to pick up 600 feet? You know, how much? You know, yell at the price, yeah, I'll be right over. It was like there were cartoonists running wild in the streets.
Those were crazy times. I've never seen that sort of energy. And like I was saying, Joe would consistently, and now that Hanna-Barbera was established as a studio that could deliver all these little studios, like for instance at Bob Clampett's, we finished the Beanie and Cecil series, and Bob Clampett, we did a whole presentation with Edgar Bergen and the Bergen family on the Charlie McCarthy show. And we did this beautiful presentation, had all the drawings on the walls, and Bob Clampett had a whole beat up couch. And so he brought it up to the storyroom and had wheels put on it. And then had a couple of guys pushing. Edgar Bergen and Candice Bergen wife around the room looking at the storybook. That was showmanship.
That's right.
But unfortunately, Bob was unable to sell another show, so that's where I went to Hanna-Barbera. And that's when Walt Disney discontinued their shorts department. So you have all of these great animators that used to work on the short cartoons out of a job. So Hanna-Barbera had the pick of the litter. And they had some of these animators that came in, and so I would think, wow, these guys were at Disney since the 30s, and that's all they knew was Walt Disney Productions. And suddenly they were thrown out in the cold, in a sense, but it gave them whole new energy to, create it. And a lot of the assistant animators that were, on the verge of becoming animators were suddenly thrown in to become animators, and the incentive to make a lot of money and the whole bit. And you had story guys and layout people and background makers from Disney knocking on the doors of Hanna-Barbera and whatever. Oh, and of course all the small commercial studios that were cropping up. Like I mentioned earlier, UPA Studios sort of set a new style and dimension in animation, limited animation and all that. When UPA did it, everyone looked at it like, oh, that's an art form. But when Hanna-Barbera did it, oh, that's a bunch of crap.
Yeah, I used to get really upset about that because, when you really look at it, maybe 5% of the output of Hanna-Barbera Studios really still hold up. But those hold up quite well. But people used to say Hanna-Barbera ruined cartoons. They destroyed cartoons. And I said, no, they saved cartoons. Because they and Jay Ward, made cartoons specifically for TV. They figured out different interesting ways to cut corners. But H&B, and probably unfortunately, because I think Jay Ward stuff is even funnier, but they never had that kind of success because they didn't have the drive to make a lot of money. I don't think. I never worked for Jay Ward, but from everything I've heard about him, he just wanted to make sure the stuff was funny. That was his main goal in life. But you go a little later when I came on, and I find this kind of interesting because we were always getting these crazy shows to work on, that would make no sense. Like, well, the one I mentioned when I was doing my Chalk Talk, I remember they had some new Flintstone stuff, and I thought I was going to be working on that. And it's like, no, you get to work on this new Casper the Ghost cartoon. Okay, well, Floyd and I worked on that. But it wasn't just Casper the Ghost. It was Casper and the Space Angels. And the Space Angels were two women CHPs in the future on flying motorcycles. And they were in the future or in outer space. We never knew. I went because we'd have to design, everything in every shot and lay it out for the cameras. And they'd have crowds, and I went to the story editor, I remember, Ray Parker.
Yeah.
And I said, is this in the future? Or is this in outer space? Because we're doing crowd scenes, and I'd like to reuse them if possible. Do we put robots and aliens in there, or should they all be humans? What's the setting? He says, I don't know. You're the story editor. Well, we sold this so fast, and the way that stuff was sold was Joe Barbera would go to the network, and he'd show them all these different shows he had. And for example, in the case of this one, it was like an animated Chip show, and it was like an animated Laverne and Shirley kind of show, and then it was a Casper the Ghost show. Oh, and then they had a Jetson show they was trying to sell, and then people of the network would go, no, we like this one with Casper. We like the thing with the Jetsons too. And Joe would go, no problem, I'll combine it. So he's selling a show, you know, and he wouldn't like, it wouldn't be like a long negotiated, I mean, he'd go right to it, but he wouldn't be able to call Bill and say, you know, what, you know, send a rocket to outer space. We need aliens with 4 arms to draw these 4 times faster. You know? but I mean, that's when you've got shows like, remember the Thing show from the Fantastic Four, where he was actually a teenager and you had the Thing ring, do your thing, that all of us really hated, and he fought like a gang that was like the Bronco Bunch on Pebbles and Bam Bam show. That was because they had a show about a teenage monster. They were trying to sell a Fantastic Four show, and I think they had something that had a biker gang in it, and it wound up all being combined. The saddest thing is, guess who wound up working on that show? He didn't produce it, but they had him writing gags until they had sold something more appropriate for him. They had Tex Avery working on that show. You know, and here's a story though about how these guys, you know, the world perceived them as kind of con men animators, but all those old directors, you know, Floyd mentioned some of them, Clampett, Fritz Freeling, even Chuck Jones, and certainly Bill and Joe, they all respected Tex. They all agreed, you know, not in print necessarily, but word came down that they all thought Tex was the best director, at least of cartoon shorts, that they'd ever had. And it turned out, we didn't know this at the time, but Tex's adult son had committed suicide, and Tex was really in bad shape, understandably. And it wasn't like Tex was an alcoholic, because he wasn't, but he was drinking because he was just so distraught. And Bill and Joe heard this, and Tex wasn't working at Cascade Studios anymore on those Frito Bandito spots or Bugs Bunny spots. And they hired Tex to come back in the studio because they thought, we love this guy, we don't want to see something bad happen to Tex. We'll give him something to do, it'll distract him from thinking about the death of his son. And Tex came in, and he was kind of like a human version of Droopy. He was just very, very quiet, very nice guy, but he said, don't call me Tex, boys, my name's Fred. You could tell he was down. But little by little, they gave him stuff to do. And even though the final product, you know, he died within less than a year after he was there. But first of all, we were so excited to have Tex in our midst. It was like, it gave us, it felt like maybe Hanna-Barbera had legitimacy again.
Yeah.
You know, and Tex had another old vet working with him, a really nice man named Chuck Couch, who had been a director at MGM too. He directed a lot of Barney Bear cartoons. And they had a sign up on the door of their office that said Sun City after the retirement community they had down in Southern California. And Tex would just ignore the schedules, you know, he wanted to make the stuff good. And the funniest but saddest story is he had this pilot for a show that they were trying to sell and did sell to CBS called Quickie Koala. And Quickie Koala was kind of a variation on Droopy, and he was this very mild little koala bear. But he had super speed to the point where you wouldn't even see him like the Flash moving. He'd just blink out and then pop in another place. Well, it probably would have worked except on a Saturday morning Hanna-Barbera cartoon at that point. I think kids just thought, oh, they forgot to put him in the scene. But his first episode was about the 3 little pigs move out of their house, and Quickie Koala sublets it from him. But the wolf doesn't know this, so the big bad wolf now finding himself facing a koala bear. And, you know, the gags escalated, and then, typical of Tex, the final scenes, he cut in footage from like nuclear test sites. And CBS wouldn't run it. It's like, we can't put this on the air. Well, here Tex died, and we were all feeling bad, but I mean, he was a pretty old guy, but still, we loved Tex. And CBS found out they put a new title card on it that said a Tex Avery Classic and put it on the air. And the gag going around H&B with the writers was, if you want to sell your gag, die.
There was a moment I had with Tex. This was, like Scott said, like the last year or two that he was there, then he passed away. So during lunchtime, actually I had some T-shirts made for the whole crew, some god-awful looking T-shirts with the logo of Quickie Koala on it. And I wanted to show Tex as soon as they came in. So during my lunch break, I went down to the main building at Hanna-Barbera, and I knocked on his door, and he was in there. He and I had a little conversation. We were just talking about, different things and T-shirt and stuff, and the conversation lasted about a half hour. And Tex just puts his head down, and then he puts his head up and looks at me, and he told me, he didn't know who I was, so he told me, do you think my cartoons are funny? And then I said, what do you mean, Tex? There's a book out, a new book that you have done called Tex Avery, King of Cartoons. How can you say that, Tex? You're a legend. And we kind of let it go at that. He says, well, it was nothing, but I think it was because of his son, maybe.
Well, plus too, I mean, at that point with Tex, I know we're talking about Hanna-Barbera, we might as well talk about Tex a little bit. We didn't have VHS players or beta players yet, and the one way you'd see, or two ways you'd see Tex's cartoons. If a local channel had like a package of MGM cartoons, you could turn it on and hope you might catch one of Tex's. The other way, which seemed like it would be better, but was actually worse, was they'd have Tex Avery cartoon festivals. And seeing them was the equivalent of like not eating a couple of peanuts, but like eating a dump truck full of them. Because, 7-minute cartoons were 7 minutes for a particular reason. It was like a little appetizer before the main show. And even Texas stuff, as good as it was, after seeing 3 of them, you kind of felt bloated, My brain has too many gags in it. And then you'd sit there and there'd be another dozen of them, and it was just kind of a waste of your time because by that point you really weren't in a condition to appreciate how brilliant they were. Plus you'd see that Tex would repeat gags from cartoon to cartoon, and a lot of people thought, well, Tex is just lazy. But it wasn't the case at all. Tex was like my observation of working with him, he was like a scientist. He really felt like, well, maybe I should expose this for 2 more frames. Maybe this would be better if I staged it from the other side. He always was looking to make the cartoon funnier, and if he thought the gag could have been funnier, that's why he did it again, because it was like he was in search of the perfect gag somehow. And my favorite Tex cartoon, I won't get back to Bill and Joe, but my favorite Tex cartoon is one of the last ones he did for MGM, which is called Deputy Droopy. And that's one of those cartoons where it's like, you think, okay, well, it's going to end now. You're not looking at your clock because, this is a great cartoon. You're going, okay, he's run out of gags now. And then he did like 20 more that were even wilder, that took you into places. I mean, it's like this guy's inexhaustible, The only problem with that was his end gag was about, the whole thing was about, they didn't want to wake up the sheriff. And then he found out he's got a hearing aid. It's kind of like, well, Tex, maybe it should just ended with another H-bomb explosion. And what's interesting too is that's also was laid out and designed by Ed Benedict, who was really the guy that designed almost all the earliest Hanna-Barbera characters. Willie, by the time you were there, you worked on the Jetsons, but I know that you were involved with stuff like the Gilly Gorilla and Peter Bottom. Is that, in my mind, that was kind of the second wave of Hanna-Barbera?
Yeah, we were, again, like you said, the second wave. It was fun. They wanted to kind of get back to some of the old recipe of that type of cartoon, short cartoons and all that, you know. And they made a very big deal about the premiere of Magilla Gorilla. They got a professional film crew that came to the studio and did a Magilla Gorilla special. In other words, they did the sequence of animation until the very finished product. So they would start with the story department and go, basically the same scene is being shown. And then they shot us layouts and the voice recording and this and that. It was a nice, you might say, a documentary. And they ran that prior to the premiere of the Magilla Gorilla show. So they had a big press party during that party, and tents set up, and all this food, and all of the people that worked on it come down, and drinks were flowing, and I
Banana daiquiri was wrong.
then I realized, you know, the ink and paint girls are all still working. And they're upstairs, and here we are partying it up. So I go to Mr. Hanna. I say, hey, Bill, you know, all your girls are upstairs slaving away, and they should at least come down and partake in the party at least for an hour or something. And so Bill, by that time, had a few. So he was game for the idea. So I went up there with him. And then we walked into the and there's Bill Hanna. And the girls all look so, trying to look busy. And I said, girls, I says, Mr. Hanna wants to invite you girls down to the party. And they weren't quite sure, but since Bill was there, the supervisor, I forgot the phone. But anyway, they says, okay, girls, take a break and go down. And they were partying it up. And so when the party ended, it was a beautiful night. And I talked earlier about my little red sports car. So it was time to leave. So I got in my little red sports car, my top was down, and I'm going along, and I get on the Hollywood freeway, and boom, the sky opens up, and oh, thunder, lightning, I'm getting all rained on. And I said, oh, the wrath of Bill Hanna.
I always thought you were going to say that when Joe Barbera asked girls to come join the party, he had something completely different. He had a redhead with her top down.
That's the Sparky Moore story. We can't tell that here anyway, so. But there are many funny Hanna-Barbera stories. The infamous gag wall where Scott and I would put up gags on the wall every day. I started out with just a couple of gags, and then pretty soon it escalated into being a full wall of gags, basically making fun of Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera. And all the employees would come up to look at it and have a laugh every day. Then I remember Bill Hanna, I thought he took it well, but then there was one gag that really kind of bothered him. And wasn't it the one where I pictured Bill Hanna as Robert De Niro in Raging Bill? Is that the one that offended Bill Hanna?
No, it was the Indy Jones one. Raider of the Lost
Oh.
Art of Animation. But the best ones that you did, and I did a few of them too, we were friends with the publicist for the studio, a lady,
Oh, yes.
Sarah Baisley.
Sarah Baisley.
And you know those publicity shots where they'll have like Bill and Joe, and you see they're like pretending like they're signing Yogi Bear to sign his contract. So it's like they're there with an empty chair, or it's Bill is there and Joe isn't in there, or Joe's there and Bill isn't in there. Well, she gave us all those photos so we could have, you know, Bill and Joe interviewing a naked Playboy playmate. You know, it was one that was Joe, and he's saying, "Hey, Bill, I hear there's a big bag of money down in the parking lot." And it was like the window had been broken, like. Dozens and dozens of those. It was great because we didn't have to do as much drawing since there was already a photo of most of them in there.
But that's kind of fun we had at Hanna-Barbera, and of course, one story that, it sounds like we make this stuff up, but it's true. We had a particular artist, rather energetic artist named Phil Mendes, who wanted to have his own private office, and he had gone to Jane Barbera about getting an office, and of course Jane had said, "No, I'm sorry, there's no room, you'll just have to stay in the cubicle with everybody else." So what Phil did, he moved his drawing table and all of his equipment into the men's room. And he added on to men, D-E-Z. So he said, Mendes. He was literally working in the men's room for about a week before the studio was so embarrassed because that word was getting out that a Hanna-Barbera artist was actually working in the men's room. They were so embarrassed by that, they actually gave Phil his own private office.
I remember they built a big new building next to the original building, which they moved into about the time they made McGill a Gorilla. I'm going to there. And they had this new building that was supposedly going to be a warehouse, and instead decided to move all the cartoonists into it, which I thought was pretty funny. And then a few years later, it was, from all the wear and tear, they wanted to repaint all the walls in there. And as soon as the paint dried, Phil came in and like with a big heavy grease pencil drew like a mural down the entire hall of his characters, not the Hanna-Barbera. And Bill Hanna hit the roof because they couldn't even paint it over because it was with a grease pencil, so they had to prime the thing all over again. And going back to something we were talking about with Bill and Joe, they were pretty old by the time I was there. And yet, as Floyd was saying, these people now, they run studios, all they think the way to get a cartoon made is to send it to the Orient. They have no idea what production is. And I really think that even at their, they were actually even older than me. They would, if they thought that the floor needed sweeping, or if Bill, he came in and helped me edit stuff. They would do any job in the building that was needed because they'd done every job in the building at one time or another. But the interesting thing that I always thought about was the fact that they never seemed, in conversation with them, all that impressed with their own material at Hanna-Barbera.
Yeah.
I think they loved Tom and Jerry because that was like their good old days for that. But Hanna-Barbera was created out of survival.
Yeah.
It had a whole different reason for existing. And I know they were always proud of like Yogi Bear and the Flintstones, but I never really got a sense that they could even figure out why guys like me or Phil here liked their cartoons, because I don't think they necessarily liked them. I just thought they were more interested in how much more successful they could make us. And even though they're both very wealthy guys, I think that it was really important to them to keep their crews working, because I don't think they liked laying us off.
No, they didn't. The one thing I can say about Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera, the one thing that always sticks with me is that they provided jobs for a lot of artists who were out of work. When Disney cut back, when other studios closed, they could always find work at Hanna-Barbera. So say what you will about their product, Bill and Joe kept artists working. They could have just shipped it all overseas, but I think they actually cared about their employees. They really did care. To date, executives could care less about where their show goes, whether it stays here in the country or is shipped overseas. But these old guys really cared about Americans having a job. And boy, you don't see that today.
Yeah, in fact, now, if you get hired at Disney or Warner Brothers or one of these places, the day they hire you, they tell you what your last day is going to be.
Yeah.
They already know it because they've planned it out so they don't have to pay you any more perks than they have to.
Not one more dollar than they have to pay.
In fact, when I was working on the Duck Dodger show, you know, production dragged down a little bit, and we still hadn't worked on the final episode, I think 13 half hours. So they actually were more interested in paying us freelance. They paid a higher rate because they still knew that they were saving money by not having us on staff.
Yeah.
It's like the crazy people were running the show there.
We have a little time left, like 5 minutes. I wanted to sneak in maybe a question and answer. You
Yeah.
wanted to ask questions for these